Let's get started with the next set of 25 questions. Which Azure feature helps reduce downtime by automatically moving workloads when a host fails? Correct answer: availability sets. Explanation. Availability sets distribute VMs across multiple physical servers to protect against hardware failures, ensuring high availability. Why others are incorrect? Express route, private connectivity, not availability management. Azure Load Balancer distributes traffic but doesn't prevent downtime from hardware failures. Azure Backup provides recovery options, not uptime guarantees. Which Azure service allows for real-time analytics on streaming data? Correct answer: Azure Stream Analytics. Explanation. Azure Stream Analytics processes and analyzes real-time streaming data from sources like IoT devices or logs. Why others are incorrect? Azure Data Lake stores large volumes of data but doesn't analyze it in real time. Azure Synapse Analytics for large-scale data warehousing, not streaming. Azure HD Insight runs big data frameworks but not specialized for real-time streams. Which Azure service should you use to create a private connection between your on-premises network and Azure? Correct answer: Azure Express Route. Explanation. Azure Express Route provides private, dedicated fiber connections between on-premises infrastructure and Azure, bypassing the public internet. Why others are incorrect? Azure VPN Gateway uses encrypted tunnels over the public internet, not private circuits. Azure Virtual Network creates networks in Azure but not physical private links. Azure Bastion secure RDP SSH over the Azure portal, not a network connection. Which Azure service can be used to orchestrate workflows between multiple services without writing code? Correct answer: Azure Logic Apps. Explanation. Azure Logic Apps automates workflows by connecting services through pre-built connectors without needing code. Why others are incorrect? Azure Functions executes custom code, not low-code workflows. Azure Event Grid routes events, doesn't build workflows. Azure Service Bus provides messaging, not workflow automation. Which Azure service offers globally distributed multi-model NoSQL databases? Correct answer: Azure Cosmos DB. Explanation. Azure Cosmos DB is a globally distributed, multi-model NoSQL database service with low latency access and multiple APIs, SQL, MongoDB, Cassandra, etc. Why others are incorrect? Azure SQL Database, relational database, not NoSQL. Azure Table Storage, single model NoSQL, not multi-model. Azure Data Lake, storage for large datasets, not a database. Which Azure service enables you to schedule jobs that run in the cloud or on premises? Correct answer: Azure Scheduler. Explanation. Azure Scheduler lets you run jobs such as calling HTTP endpoints or posting messages to queues on a predefined schedule. Note, it's now largely replaced by logic apps and automation for new workloads. Why others are incorrect? Azure Functions executes code based on triggers but not specialized for job scheduling. Azure Automation focuses on process automation for managing Azure resources, not just job scheduling. Azure Logic Apps can schedule workflows but not purely for job scheduling. What is the main benefit of Azure Resource Groups? Correct answer: they organize resources for easier management. Explanation. Resource groups act as containers that hold related Azure resources for management, deployment, and monitoring. Why others are incorrect? Control VM scaling, done via auto-scaling or load balancers, not resource groups. Store application data, done by databases or storage accounts. Enforce encryption, managed via security services, not groups. Which Azure service is best for hosting a simple website without managing servers? Correct answer, Azure App Service. Explanation. Azure App Service is a PaaS offering for hosting web apps, APIs, and mobile backends without managing infrastructure. Why others are incorrect. AKS, best for containerized workloads, not a simple website. Azure Functions, for event-driven code, not a full web app hosting platform. VMs, requires you to manage OS and web server setup, which Azure Storage option is optimized for storing large amounts of unstructured object data. Correct answer, Azure Blob Storage. Explanation. Blob storage stores large amounts of unstructured data like images, videos, and backups. Why others are incorrect. Azure Files, shared file storage over SMB protocol. Azure Disk Storage, persistent disks for VMs, not object storage. Azure Queue Storage, message storage, not large file storage. Which Azure service offers centralized management for policies, security, and compliance across multiple Azure subscriptions. Correct answer, Azure Management Groups. Explanation. Management groups allow you to organize multiple subscriptions and apply governance rules at scale. Why others are incorrect. Azure Security Center, security posture management, not subscription grouping. Azure Policy, governance rules, but applied at resource or subscription level. Azure Resource Manager, deployment framework, not subscription hierarchy tool. Which Azure service helps you automate configuration and management of servers using PowerShell scripts? Correct answer, Azure Automation. Explanation. Azure Automation runs PowerShell or Python scripts to manage Azure and on-premises resources. Why others are incorrect. Azure Functions runs event-driven code, not configuration management. Azure DevOps, CI/CD platform, not configuration scripting. Azure Logic Apps, workflow automation, not server configuration scripts. Which Azure networking feature ensures that traffic stays within Microsoft's network backbone instead of traversing the public internet? Correct answer, Azure ExpressRoute. Explanation. ExpressRoute provides private, dedicated network connections between on-premises and Azure, avoiding public internet routing. Why others are incorrect. VPN Gateway uses encrypted public internet tunnels. Azure Bastion, secure RDP SSH without public IP, not private WAN routing. VNet defines a network inside Azure, but doesn't guarantee private backbone use. Which Azure service is a cloud-based security information and event management system? Correct answer, Azure Sentinel. Explanation. Azure Sentinel collects, detects, investigates, and responds to security threats using SIEM and SOAR capabilities. Why others are incorrect. Azure Security Center manages security posture, not full SIEM. Azure Monitor, performance monitoring, not security event management. Azure Firewall, network security filtering, not SIEM. Which Azure Compute option is most cost-effective for workloads that can be interrupted? Correct answer, Spot VMs. Explanation. Spot VMs let you use unused Azure capacity at deep discounts, but they can be evicted when capacity is needed elsewhere. Why others are incorrect. Reserved instances. Good for predictable workloads, not interruptible ones. Pay as you go. Flexible, but more costly for steady workloads. Dedicated hosts. More expensive, reserved physical servers. Which Azure tool allows you to calculate the estimated monthly cost for specific Azure services? Correct answer, Azure Pricing Calculator. Explanation. Azure Pricing Calculator lets you estimate the monthly cost of Azure services before deployment. Why others are incorrect. TCO Calculator estimates migration savings, not monthly costs. Azure Advisor provides cost optimization recommendations, not estimates. Azure Cost Management tracks costs after deployment, not before. Which Azure service allows you to deploy a managed relational database without managing the underlying OS or database engine? Correct answer. Azure SQL Database Explanation. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed PaaS offering for relational databases where Microsoft handles OS updates, patching, backups, and high availability. Why others are incorrect. Azure Blob Storage, Object Storage, not relational database. Azure Database for MySQL, similar PaaS, but for MySQL, not SQL Server. Azure Virtual Machines requires full management of the OS and database engine, which Azure feature can automatically shut down and start VMs on a schedule to save costs. Correct answer. Azure Automation Explanation. Azure Automation can run scripts to stop-start VMs at scheduled times, reducing unnecessary compute costs. Why others are incorrect. Azure Policy enforces governance, not automation. Azure Logic Apps automates workflows, not VM scheduling specifically. Azure Cost Management tracks and analyzes costs but doesn't execute schedules. Which Azure service provides a scalable file share accessible via the SMB protocol? Correct answer. Azure Files Explanation. Azure Files offers fully managed SMB file shares accessible via cloud or on-premises systems. Why others are incorrect. Azure Blob Storage, Object Storage, not SMB-based file shares. Azure Disk Storage, used for VM disks, not shared file access. Azure Queue Storage, for message queuing, not file storage. Which Azure service helps you migrate on-premises servers, databases, and applications to Azure? Correct answer. Azure Migrate Explanation. Azure Migrate offers discovery, assessment, and migration tools for moving workloads to Azure. Why others are incorrect. Azure DevOps, CI/CD, and project management, not migration. Azure Backup, data backup service, not migration. Azure Site Recovery, disaster recovery solution, not full migration. Which Azure feature ensures high availability within a single region by distributing VMs across multiple data centers? Correct answer, availability zones. Explanation. Availability zones are physically separate data centers within a region that protect workloads from data center failures. Why others are incorrect. Region pairs, used for geographic disaster recovery. Resource groups, logical organization, not high availability. Traffic manager, DNS-based traffic routing, not fault isolation. Which Azure service is best for storing massive datasets for analytics workloads? Correct answer, Azure Data Lake Storage. Explanation. Azure Data Lake Storage is optimized for storing large-scale structured and unstructured data for big data analytics. Why others are incorrect. Azure Blob Storage, general object storage, less specialized for analytics. Azure SQL Database, relational data, not big data storage. Azure Cosmos DB, NoSQL database, not optimized for data lake workloads. Which Azure tool lets you manage multiple Azure subscriptions from a single interface? Correct answer. Azure Management Groups. Explanation. Management groups allow centralized governance, policy enforcement, and organization across multiple subscriptions. Why others are incorrect. Azure Cost Management manages expenses, not governance hierarchy. Azure Resource Manager, deployment framework, not subscription hierarchy. Azure Policy enforces rules within subscriptions, not across many. Which Azure service should you use for managed message queues between applications? Correct answer, Azure Service Bus. Explanation. Azure Service Bus enables reliable message queuing and integration between distributed applications. Why others are incorrect. Azure Event Grid. Event routing, not message queuing. Azure Logic Apps, workflow automation, not queuing. Azure Functions, executes code not designed for message brokering. Which Azure service enables you to run containerized apps without managing Kubernetes? Correct answer. Azure Container Instances explanation. Azure Container Instances ACI lets you run containers directly in Azure without orchestrators like Kubernetes. Why others are incorrect. AKS requires managing Kubernetes cluster. VMs requires OS management, not container focused. App Service runs web apps, not generic container hosting. Which Azure service can replicate VMs and on-premises workloads for disaster recovery? Correct answer. Azure Site Recovery explanation. Azure Site Recovery replicates workloads to a secondary location for failover during outages. Why others are incorrect. Azure Backup stores data backups but doesn't handle live failover. Azure Migrate, migration planning, not DR replication. Azure Monitor, performance tracking, not disaster recovery.